Hello, it is the day of the sun, and this is the difficult one. But I'm not going to make it difficult for you. I've just taken a load of stuff out that makes it undifficult. But unfortunately, it's too difficult for me to explain it in an easy way. So this is more of links to technical shit. But I might be able to explain a few things as I go, but not much. So, in the Financial Times, we have about the US shadow banking system. The important thing to know here is that it was the shadow banking system that seized up in the credit crisis, not so much the banking system. Everyone goes on about the banking system because they know one or two things about the banking system, but that really wasn't the great big problem thing. Okay, and the blue bars here were the problem. It was the private shadow money. Call it mortgage-backed securities for short. They went away, as you can see, late 2008. But they've come back online again now, but not following the same path, bottom left, top right, that they were. Public shadow money is more treasuries and what have you, and that is still following the bottom left, top right. But look at the numbers here. The public is at 19 trillion and the private are at 9 trillion. This amount, this shadow banking thing, or what I did, I kind of threw in a couple of weeks ago, compare it to the 1% play with bits of paper. I used the king as the example. They play with bits of paper, and in the banking system, we play with money. That sort of idea. The 99% play with money, and the 1% play with bits of paper, linked to the king, the government. But now it's more modern. It's linked to via mortgage-backed securities, linked to the banking system, but it's commercial paper, asset-backed commercial paper, all sorts of stuff. But you can see the enormous amounts, and the shadow banking system, the 1% playground of assets swapping around, is bigger than the banking system. Quite a lot bigger. Right, moving on to 1B, outstanding value of private US debt securities. Now, you can see that these are stepping down, and I've put this in to show that this is like that we've been talking about in the private banking side, where credit isn't being taken up anymore by the private side, so it must be taken up by the government side, or things slip into a depression. And this is a very similar thing on the, call it the 1% side, the capital markets or the shadow banking system, where the private side is slipping away and they need more treasuries to play with. So they need the government to do the deficit spending so they can play with the treasuries as well, to fill the gap that is being caused by the private US debt securities going away. And all the time, the central bank manipulating this. I'll just leave that there, I think. Right, this is from the paper that they've been quoting in this Financial Times article by Credit Suisse, which is worth reading all the way through. I forget if I linked to it, but at the bottom it's linked to Perry mailing that I've already talked about in the past. So there's not much that's new here, but I haven't been putting forward a lot of these things that I read about because individually they don't make sense. I can't just say, oh, and they're doing this now, because it only makes sense in a context, and I haven't put enough of the context forward. Anyway, a sharp fiscal easing then created a flood of safe collateral that caused the public shadow money, treasuries, mortgage-backed securities and agencies. I've really put this in for two reasons, so we can see what they mean by public shadow money. Public shadow money, that was in 1A, public shadow money has gone up to 19.5 trillion, which was treasuries, mortgage-backed securities and agencies, the Fannie Freddie paper, that's the public one, to soar, fully offsetting the contraction in private shadow money, which were corporate bonds, asset-backed securities and non-agency mortgages, the private label mortgage bundles. You see, it's all too much, this, isn't it, really? And this is why I've left it out. And this really can be considered as, if you're interested, go read. It's a long article by Cardiff Garcia in the FT, and there's quite a few links in it as well. But if you're interested in what's really happening behind the scenes, this is must-know stuff. Central banks, meanwhile, were lowering interest rates and finding ways to improve the liquidity, value and moneyness of various types of public and private collateral through their balance sheet operations. This is the Fed bailing out the shadow banking system. Back to Cardiff Garcia writing in the FT, public shadow money from increased government issuance replaced the loss of private shadow money in combination with other measures, mitigated the effects of these deflationary forces. Now these are deflationary forces within the huge, monstrously important capital markets shadow banking system. Where have I gone now? Okay. Towards the bottom of the article, linking to Perry Merling, that I have been pushing a small video that he did. Perry Merling, who is one of the chief people at INET, whose recent paper is cited in the Credit Suisse note down at the bottom of it, likes to say that the Fed became not just the lender of last resort in the crisis, but dealer of last resort. In the end, it was not enough the Fed putting out liquidity to keep these shadow markets buoyant. They actually had to buy the underlying, the mortgage-backed securities, because the value was going down. The shadow banking system were happy to play with derivatives of the underlying mortgage-backed securities, which are in a way derivatives of the actual mortgages, but the realness had to be brought down. Liquidity wasn't enough to keep the credit default swap market going, and it came down to looking at actually the value of the mortgage-backed securities. And when push came to shove, the Fed had to come in and say, all right, I'll keep the price of those up by buying them, which they did, bought about $1.3 trillion worth. And that the new paradigm for monetary policy is to think of asset markets, not banking institutions. Because of the size of these capital markets, it overwhelms the banking system. But it's good to know that they are separated, but in a way they're also globbed together, certainly under the wing of the central bank. And talk about market liquidity, not funding liquidity. In other words, include shadow banking, though he prefers the term new market-based credit system, which is probably a genius thing to call it, new market-based credit system, just as we're getting to calling it the shadow banking system. And he explains the new kinds of exposure the Fed has taken on since the crisis, because it had to think about shadow banking. It really had to think about shadow banking. And that's the thing I'm worried about via Perry Merling, that is the Fed actually capable of thinking enough about the shadow banking system? And if it does, will the shadow banking system just come and lean on the Fed and push it into decisions it really doesn't want to make, a bit like the banking system does? By adding short-term do I really want to read this? Pause and read if you want. Right, let's go on to market focus. This is the Credit Suisse paper, and it's only about 14 pages long. They've really kept it short. I'll move straight on to the conclusions, 2B. The key takeaways from our analysis are that until output gaps close and private collateral begins to grow again, in other words, there's enough private stuff being pumped into the shadow system. Underlying deflation risks will persist in the shadow system. Central banks' balance sheets and fiscal debt may be needed to be further expanded. In other words, the government needs to sell more debt to give them paper to play with, and the central bank needs to be there for liquidity and as market maker of last resort by buying the underlying if necessary. Interest rates will stay in a historically low range, though not always as low as now. And when they're talking interest rates will stay low, we're talking nobody can see on the horizon putting interest rates up. We can see a token gesture for token gesture reasons, but no putting interest rates up as far as the eye can see. And these guys can see further than most guys. The more macroprudential regulation is driven by hostility to the shadow banking system. The last thing, the whole paper really is to say, look, the regulators don't understand the shadow banking system. They're scared of it, but the paper is trying to lay out why it is essential part of the system. Now, if because the regulators are scared of the shadow banking system because they don't understand it and go for the shadow banking system and try and close it down because it's unregulated, naughty things will happen in the main economy, just like naughty things will happen if they overregulate the banking part. Right, this I've gone back to finish. This is the last paragraph in the initial Financial Times article. Does the shadow banking system's relationship to monetary policy have any implication for the Smithian, that'll be Adam Smith, I would think, neo-Wickselian, and that's Wicksell and a dead economist, which awaits the natural rate of interest imminently rising to and exceeding the federal funds rate? Will the natural rate of interest, whatever that might be, we've never seen one. Has anybody ever seen one of these natural rate of interest things? But will there be external forces pulling the central bank Fed funds target rate up? Is there an equivalent for the shadow banking system? Who knows? Perhaps something related to collateral haircuts, because this is all repo. This is all based on repo. And if you don't know what repo is, go to Wikipedia and look it up, because the 1% stuff is all based on repo. And as you put a repo in, there's a borrower and a lender, and I can't explain repo here, but it's just about borrowing and lending collateralized, and the collateral takes a haircut dependent on the risk of the collateral, and that could be called the interest rate. If it has to take a really big haircut, you could say that that's a bigger interest rate, because you need to post more collateral to borrow a smaller amount of money. So what about the NGDP guys? That's the nominal GDP guys. Now there's, over in the States especially, there's huge arguments been going on, to my knowledge, for a couple of years about what the Fed should target. And nominal GDP is something that's been put out by lots of people. But then these are all economists, and then they argue and argue and argue, and I've just been going, I have not a clue what you're talking about. The MMTers, they get a mention because this is where they come in. And John Carney, who in a way is an MMTer. So I'm not going to go to MMT this time, but I'm going to go nominal GDP targeting via Scott Sumner, number 3 link, The Money Illusion. And this is a very big effort on Scott's side to try and make some sense of the argument for NGDP targeting. And even the headline, you can see the title is tricky: instruments, indicators, targets, transmission mechanisms and the global variables. And this, he admits or says, is my pathetic attempt at a general theory of monetary policy. And in it is this table, which is interesting and would have to be taken into account by anybody that is taking what should the Fed be targeting, or should the Fed be targeting anything. Now, the Fed is going to target something. So you can forget your should the Fed be targeting anything. The Fed is there. It's being lent on by all sorts of people. So it is going to target something. So what should it target? It's going to target something. And it's probably going to be interest rates, as it always has been. Read through these chart. I'll leave you to pause and link. We've got country money growth, RGDP, inflation. So if you look down, say Brazil at the top, money growth for a 30-odd year period was 77.4. Real GDP growth was 5.6. Inflation was 77.8. And if you look down, the money growth, say Argentina below, over, and again, almost 40-year period, money growth was 72%, inflation was 76%. Now, if you read down those, you go, well, it's obvious that money growth is the equivalent to inflation over an extended period of time. No getting around it. But if you read the article and have read other articles, you know that life just is not that simple. And these would have been reserves that were getting out to the real world. But that's not the situation we have now. I'll leave you with that. If that's what this is kind of, if that sort of thing attracts you, that's the link. So next we go to John Carney, which is CNN, link number 4. What really constrains bank lending? Now this is an easy read. He used to be a banker. He used to do these things. Now he's quite big in MMT, and he tells us in a very easy way what does constrain bankers. And bottom there paragraph, the biggest constraint on lending is the basic business model for banking. Explained in a very simple way in a short article. What is the business model of banking? And it's a very interesting little read. It's the easiest of all these links. I've thrown this in again just in case you didn't read why QE is being missold, and the links to the Macaulay Zoltan Posar post that I did midweek. If you didn't have time then and thought you might do it again but have lost it, go and give this a read now, and the comments. Right. This is the Aleph blog, who again is trying to make sense of the Fed stuff and all this banking, Fed backing up and buying and lender of last resort and credit, all that sort of stuff. But I've just drawn out 2 charts which should be interesting, that again you can pause and look at. This is the liabilities of the Fed. The Fed is a big bank, and it banks for all the other banks. So it being a big bank, it has a balance sheet, assets and liabilities, and it doesn't, underneath the bottom of the liabilities, it doesn't have capital, it doesn't have equity, but it's just got assets and liabilities, which hopefully will be balancing to a certain extent. I think the Fed's got slightly different ways of balancing their assets and liabilities, but link 6 is liabilities of the Fed, 6b is assets of the Fed by type, and you can just go through, and if you understand what these things are, agencies, CBL swaps, etc., it'll make sense to you. But if not, it won't. But it's good just to know the enormity of it, the way the Fed balance sheet has grown since 2008, and where things have appeared on the asset side and on the liabilities side. Link number 7 is Worthwhile Canadian Initiative. This is Nick Rowe, who during the Krugman-Keene argument came for a while on the side of Krugman, and I thought, oh hell, he's got the brain the size of a planet. If he's going to come in behind Krugman, I'm going to at least go neutral on this and maybe even whatever Nick Rowe says is not going to be too far wrong. But towards the end of the argument, he backed off backing Krugman and went neutral himself. Another thing that this convinced me of is that blogs should not use the entire width of a page, because his writing comes at you in great big blocks, fills the screen up, and you go, I'm lost. You're lost even before you start. But this is from gold standard to CPI standard. Inflation targeting is a much better monetary policy than the gold standard, but that's not what this post is about. Bottom paragraph, if you believe that monetary theory fundamentally changed or needed to change when modern central banks abandoned the gold standard, then this post is for you. And it tidies up, if you can get through it, it tidies up an awful lot of loose ends, and the man's a genius. He just knows his stuff, in my humble opinion, sort of thing. 8 is The Economist, the truth about all those excess reserves. Now, as the same as the Giancani one in CNN, this is an easy, small, easy read, and it's the truth about those excess reserves. Written from Washington, it's The Economist, it wouldn't have been written by Greg Ip, because the article makes sense. One of the biggest challenges facing the Fed is widespread ignorance about how it actually operates. Inflation is falling, unemployment is 10%, yet some people think it's running an inflationary policy because an extra 1 trillion of reserves are in the banking system. And it just carries on. It's easy, it's light. So besides the Carney article, that's the easy way into learning a little bit more about what's what. So where am I up to now? This looks like my last snip. Yeah, number 9's the last one. This is Alia, who's an annoying, I think he's a Frenchman. He's obviously a brain on a stick. He seems to speak many languages and understands all this banking system. And not just that, that's easy. The shadow banking system to horrible degrees. But he's kind of nasty about it. I follow him in Twitter, and he really turns me off. But there's no denying that he's probably is a very bright bunny. Hates gold by the look of him. Anytime gold goes down, he just tweets the price of gold going down. Anyway, he has pulled out an interesting quote here. I can tell you, this is in an Italian accent, which I won't do because it's a bit too interesting to overdo with a silly accent. I can tell you what we do and what we watch to make sure that this huge amount of central bank money we have created gets into the economy. We look at the consolidated bank balance sheets, country by country, and we see whether this liquidity creation translates itself first into deposits. It can translate into deposits either because the banks buy securities, government bonds or buildings, or because they lend money. Now, I'm starting to learn that all money from all banks kept as money is just reserves in the central bank. And they can, if it's more profitable to do so, a la John Carney's bank business model, lend that money out if it's a more profitable thing to do. They will do with those reserves what is the most profitable thing to do. Buy assets, or if they think buying a new skyscraper to impress people is the thing, that's what they'll do. So we look at that. Then if we see that deposits grow and lending grows, we will also observe later an increase in the so-called required reserves on our own central bank's balance sheet. But otherwise, we have to look at the consolidated bank balance sheets country by country. And, as you can imagine, we look at them every day, as well as inflation expectations, and that's the kind of polls for inflation expectations. Inflation expectations still scare the socks off central bankers. And target 2 balances, so you know we're talking Europe here. These are the 3 things we look at almost every day. Every day, actually, not almost every day. and central banker in question is the new ECB boss, Mario Draghi, answering a question that was, given that you said it was premature to talk about any kind of exit strategy, and that central banker just assuring everybody out there, especially in the capital markets, that there will be no real rise in the target rate, the interest rate for the foreseeable future, and that's all they want to know. It was premature to talk about any kind of exit strategy. When do you expect the ELTRO to really reveal its full force? When will it be possible to make an assessment of this credit operation? I'm getting the vibes that the European experts on this are saying that the oomph of ELTRO is already dropping off quite dramatically. Just like QE1 dropped off quite dramatically, QE2 dropped off quite dramatically. The extra stuff that the Fed did, what do they call it, when they sold the short end and bought the long end, that's already dropped off. All these central bank things are dropping off, and maybe even increasingly quickly. So the central banks will, I'm not saying they should, they will come up with new ways of putting liquidity into the banking system and the shadow banking system, and if push comes to shove, then buy the underlying securities, which are the value, the price setting for those systems, the banking system and the shadow banking system. And with ultimately infinite amounts of money, they can buy as many assets as they like to keep the prices up. They probably won't want to go to equities, but Japan did, and they will if they have to. They will do everything if they have to keep everything buoyant, because they do not know any other way. Right. That's it. Happy Easter. Bye.